The loss of 300,000 men in a single campaign, the surrender of an entire army at Stalingrad, the collapse of Germany's air superiority over Europe. These weren't just the results of Allied brilliance, they were also the product of staggering mistakes made by Germany's own high command. Hitler may have been the architect of disaster, but his generals carried out blunders so severe they crippled the Third Reich from within. Today, we're uncovering the worst German generals of World War II, from the stubborn loyalists who followed Hitler into catastrophe, to the arrogant fools who wasted men and machines, to the broken commanders who simply gave up when their armies needed them most. Field Marshal Ernst Busch was the embodiment of loyalty without leadership. He rose through the ranks as a disciplined and dependable officer, the kind of man Hitler valued because he never questioned orders. But when the war demanded creativity, flexibility, and initiative, Busch had none of these qualities. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Busch initially commanded the German 16th Army. His forces surged into the Soviet Union, capturing vast swaths of territory. Yet as supply lines stretched thin and resistance stiffened, Busch refused to recognize the reality on the ground. When his officers warned him that his men were exhausted, undersupplied, and facing an early winter, Busch brushed off their concerns. He simply parroted Hitler's optimism. By late 1941, Busch's forces were bogged down outside Moscow. German soldiers froze in inadequate uniforms, ammunition was scarce, and logistics had collapsed. Instead of adapting, Busch doubled down on Hitler's unrealistic orders. His men paid the price in blood. Fast forward to 1944. The Soviets launched Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating offensives of the entire war. Within weeks, entire German divisions were surrounded and obliterated. More than 300,000 German soldiers were lost. Busch's response? Nothing. He lacked the creativity to mount a counterattack, the courage to retreat, and the authority to push back against Hitler's delusions. He sat idle while his command disintegrated. Busch wasn't cruel or flamboyant. His failure was simpler. He confused obedience with competence. And in the end, his blind loyalty destroyed one of Germany's most important armies. Alfred Jodl. If Busch was the loyal fool on the battlefield, General Alfred Jodl was the loyal fool at the strategy table. As chief of the operations staff at Hitler's high command, Jodl was one of the men closest to Hitler throughout the war. His job was to coordinate the German war effort, provide strategic guidance, and, most importantly, challenge Hitler when his ideas were reckless. But Jodl almost never challenged him. Instead, he reinforced Hitler's worst instincts. It was Jodl who backed Hitler's refusal to allow flexible retreats in Russia. As Soviet counterattacks mounted in late 1941, other generals pleaded for a withdrawal to more defensible positions. Jodl, however, supported Hitler's Stand Fast order, which condemned tens of thousands of German troops to destruction. It was Jodl who endorsed the disastrous obsession with Stalingrad. Rather than urging a rational focus on Moscow or the Caucasus oil fields, Jodl supported pouring resources into a symbolic city that became a death trap. And it was Jodl who consistently told Hitler what he wanted to hear, even when reality was falling apart. Whether it was overestimating Luftwaffe strength, underestimating Allied capabilities, or simply denying logistical problems, Jodl's reports fed Hitler's fantasies. Unlike Göring, Jodl wasn't flamboyant. Unlike Paulus, he wasn't indecisive in the heat of battle. His failure was moral. He had the responsibility to speak truth to power, and instead he chose comfort, flattery, and survival. At Nuremberg, the consequences caught up with him. Jodl was found guilty of war crimes, sentenced to death, and hanged in 1946. Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, is remembered as one of the most infamous figures of the Nazi regime. But beneath the gaudy uniforms and theatrical speeches lay a commander who disastrously failed his service. At the start of the war, Göring inherited an air force that was the most modern and powerful in the world. The Luftwaffe had swept aside the Polish Air Force in 1939 and devastated the French in 1940. But when the war turned into a contest of endurance, Göring's flaws became impossible to hide. During the Battle of Britain, Göring promised Hitler that the RAF would be crushed in a matter of weeks. But his poor leadership undermined the campaign. Instead of focusing on destroying British radar and airfields, the RAF's lifeline, he constantly changed targets. First it was air bases, then aircraft factories, and finally, in a disastrous shift, he ordered attacks on London itself. This gave the RAF precious breathing room to recover. The result was Germany's first major defeat. The RAF survived, Britain remained in the war, and Hitler's dream of invading the British Isles was abandoned. But Göring's greatest failure came at Stalingrad. When the Sixth Army was encircled in November 1942, Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could resupply them entirely by air. This was absurd. The Sixth Army needed at least 700 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe could deliver at best 100 tons. Most days, it was far less. The consequences were catastrophic. Soldiers froze and starved while Göring continued to boast about successes that never materialized. The Sixth Army perished, and the Luftwaffe's credibility collapsed. By 1944, Göring's failures had hollowed out his air force. Allied bombers roamed freely over Germany, reducing its cities to rubble. Göring, once proclaiming that not a single enemy bomber would ever fly over the Reich, had no answers. His pilots were outnumbered, outgunned, and thrown into battle with dwindling resources. Meanwhile, Göring retreated into luxury. He stole art, indulged in morphine, and paraded in costumes while his men died. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was reduced to ashes under his command. Friedrich Paulus is one of the most tragic names in German military history. An intelligent and organized staff officer, Paulus was promoted far beyond his natural abilities when Hitler handed him command of the Sixth Army in 1942. His mission: take Stalingrad. At first, Paulus advanced with precision. His army reached the outskirts of the city and began brutal street fighting. But Stalingrad was not just another target. It became a symbolic obsession for Hitler, and Paulus, rather than resisting, allowed himself to be consumed by that obsession. When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus and encircled the Sixth Army in November 1942, Paulus faced a critical choice. He could attempt an immediate breakout, abandoning his heavy equipment but saving tens of thousands of men. Or he could wait for relief. Paulus waited. He clung to Hitler's orders to hold his ground, even as conditions grew unbearable. Ammunition dwindled. Horses were slaughtered for food, wounded soldiers froze to death in cellars, entire divisions melted away. Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, attempted a relief operation, but Paulus refused to coordinate. His army stayed trapped, shrinking by the day. In January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to either fight to the last man or take his own life. Instead, Paulus surrendered. Nearly 100,000 survivors of the Sixth Army marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Paulus wasn't a coward. He simply lacked the steel of command. He was a man who could calculate logistics, draw up plans, and organize staff, but when faced with an impossible decision, he froze. His hesitation turned a disaster into one of the greatest defeats in history. Wilhelm Keitel. If there was ever a symbol of weakness in uniform, it was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. As Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, Keitel had one of the most powerful positions in Nazi Germany. He could have been the voice of reason, the check on Hitler's reckless impulses, the defender of the professional military against political interference. Instead, Keitel became Hitler's most obedient servant. His subordinates called him Keitel, meaning yes Keitel. The nickname said it all. Keitel approved Hitler's most criminal orders. the Commissar Order, which mandated the execution of captured Soviet political officers, the Barbarossa Decree, which unleashed brutal reprisals against civilians, and countless directives that condemned prisoners of war and partisans to death. On the battlefield, Keitel was no better. He agreed with every one of Hitler's disastrous no-retreat orders, which bled the German army dry on the Eastern Front. When generals argued for strategic withdrawals to save men and regroup, Keitel overruled them, not because he believed in the orders, but because he was too spineless to oppose Hitler. Even in 1945, as Berlin collapsed, Keitel remained Hitler's puppet. While cities burned and civilians suffered, Keitel dutifully repeated Hitler's fantasies of victory. He lived in denial until the very end. At Nuremberg, Keitel was exposed as a man who bore enormous responsibility but possessed no courage. He was hanged in 1946, condemned as both a war criminal and a failure. These men weren't just bad generals, they were disasters in uniform. Their loyalty, arrogance, cowardice, and incompetence turned Hitler's delusions into reality, and in doing so, they helped bring about the destruction of Nazi Germany. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest blunders, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more content, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of World War II.